do that. Okay, we have your consent. If you don't, we're learning, Jennifer. We were just talking about that earlier. So just a quick intro. There's a couple of new people on the call here today. So I'd like folks just to say hello, kind of just where you're from and kind of what you're involved with. So welcome to you. And let me point to Simeon and welcome you to the call here.
Thank you, Daniel. Hello to everybody. Yes, so I'm joining Dr. McCoy's team here, working as a project manager for VHA, and I'll be assisting with on the Integrated Care for Kids project primarily, and other initiatives there. So I have background in working in HHS across the country on integrated case management systems and some additional system implementation, again, for not HHS specific, but definitely government systems and civic systems related.
Welcome, glad to see you on board here. And
Thank you.
Mohammed, I know that a number of people have, we saw you yesterday, but not everyone on this call. So if you just say a few words, that would be great.
Yes, so my name is Mohammed Jafari. I am the director of the LEAP project, the ONC LEAP project on patient consent. This is the awardee. I work for the San Diego Health Connect. I also would like to recognize Dwayne, our lead developer on that project, who is on the call. So we'll be here to take questions and maybe have a short presentation when it's done.
Wonderful. Dwayne, you want to just say hello?
Hi, everyone. Dwayne DeCudo. I'm the lead engineer on the LEAP Fire Consent Project.
Great, welcome. Two Dwaynes on the call here today. Anybody else? Mark, have you, I'm trying to remember if last time you were here. Mark, do you want to say hello? There you go. We can't hear you if you're saying something. Okay, having a little audio issue there. I thought that was just a Cisco thing. Sorry. All right. Well, we'll catch up with you when audio gets reconnected here. So welcome to new folks to our weekly meeting. On the agenda, you see the news roundup. There are a number of things here. We just pulled out a couple of the things, but the thing I just wanted to mention for folks, and we won't spend time talking about these things right now, but the one thing I did want to mention to folks who might not have had the opportunity yesterday to sit through the some of the ONC meeting, I thought that was super, and I know that they're going to put up a link. They're pretty good about putting that up there, but there are a couple of sessions, particularly around consent referral, that I sat through. I know a number of people on this call here sat through a bunch of them. That was really terrific, and I think they did a great job. There was really good attendance, and importantly, they you know, there's a lot of conversation. A lot of time was allocated to discussion and conversation. So if you get a chance to listen to the video, actually the second half of it was mostly all conversation and discussion around some of the technical aspects and some of the sort of governance and policy kinds of things. And I think it's all very very much in alignment with what we're trying to do here as well. So it's a really good resource, and we will post that for folks as we go forward. And feel free to comment on that. I know that Mohammed's presented yesterday, as did Kathy. So I'm sure you'll have some thoughts about that kind of questions you were getting, and how they might be able to stitch that together with what we're doing here today. So that's the one thing. The other thing I wanted to mention to folks, and we'll send out a link to this next week when we get it done. We've redesigned the hub itself a little bit to make it actually very much focused on the work we're doing now. So we're taking off a lot of the communications pieces and really focusing on the key pieces and simplifying it. So it'll hopefully become more of a easier to navigate and also more useful tool for people, for you guys, but also for new people to come in to be able to say, okay, here's Unify, here's the consent work, here's some other stuff that's happening in terms of the demonstrations, and just to really clean it up a little bit, because I know we've gotten some feedback over time that it's not so easy to not so easy to navigate and find stuff. So we're working towards making that simple. Yes, thank you, Mark, and yes, I apologize. With the DC Criminal Justice Coordinating Council on DC, and interested in many of these same topics. So welcome again, probably for the third time that I've asked you that. So with that, Brian, I know that we had just looking to see if we have any urgent updates here from the previous meeting. I know Adam wants to say a few things, but Brian, anything going on that people need to know about from you, from your side?
No, that's about it. We have something, Adam wants to give a brief update on the consent work, and otherwise we are ready to hear from Mohammed and Dwayne.
Yeah, this is Adam. I can make this very brief. We've completed all our work and we're ready to publish. All right. So I think the only thing I want to say is that we're having a meeting tomorrow of everybody on the governance teams, plural. Those for new folks, that's technical, legal, and promising practices. Anybody who wants to join any of those teams on this project, which maybe not everybody knows about, but let me know if not, or Daniel, we can fill them in. But if anybody wants to join, tomorrow's a good time to get on a call with us. It is at, I don't have it in front of me. It is tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern. And I would I'll be sending out an agenda and a reminder later today or tonight. And the other thing is that I'm busily trying to schedule interviews with subject matter experts. I think I have one already set up for Monday, 2 more coming, one for probably tomorrow and the other for early next week. And we'll keep on adding to that. Again, if anybody would like to participate, it's more fun than you can believe. So please send me an email or Amanda an email and we will sign you up if you want to play. And that's all I think I've got.
And just to clarify, Adam,
Yes, sir.
You're talking specifically about the 3 teams that
Yes.
are working on the consent scan report.
Correct.
Nationwide scan survey or interviews, as the case may be, to determine who is using what technology where for consent services, what best practices are they using, what legal or governance issues are they running into.
Exactly.
And so this is for example, the technology team that's working on this. There's an overlap with the consent technologies working group, but it is not the same thing as the consent technologies working group.
Correct. And the meeting tomorrow, thank you for that, Brian. And the meeting tomorrow is for people working on the consent project. And again, we really do well. It's a terrific piece of work. And if anybody else is interested, just let me know.
And we are just kicking it off.
Yes, sir.
So you are not too late.
Not at all.
So we'll put a link up to that. There's like a 1 page we just put up on the hub that kind of describes it succinctly. So if people want to take a peek at it, there's some information that's pretty easy to digest. And that is the timeline on this. What's important to say is it's super fast. So it's what I'm calling a disappearing task force, which means it's not a perpetual, it's not going on forever. We're going to do the work in July, part of August, and then jump into the publishing of it. So we hope to get something out early mid-September after review by our team and the RWJF grant folks. So it's not a lifetime commitment, which is
No, it's a short one and not a terribly onerous one. But yeah, okay. So thank you for Brian and Daniel for filling those blanks in.
you got it. With that, Brian, you want to do introduction for the
Sure,
CDS folks? Great,
sure.
thanks.
As most folks know, but for anyone that's new, I should emphasize that we have a number of different open source consent service projects that have been going on in the healthcare world specifically. One is Consent to Share, which was developed by SAMHSA. Actually, it was developed by FEI Systems for SAMHSA a number of years back. It is specifically focused, or was specifically focused on supporting 42 CFR Part 2 healthcare records. And then the San Diego Community Information Exchange, CIE project, got an ONC LEAP, I think it was an ONC LEAP grant to fund the development of a set of consent services for their project. And as Mohammed said when he introduced himself, I believe he's the program director for that LEAP program. And Dwayne is the technical lead for that. And they have very kindly offered to give us an overview, an introduction to the work that they've done, which is also open source. And so, Mohammed, Dwayne, I turn it over to you.
Thanks. Can I take control?
I think I gave you
my
a,
screen.
I
Thanks.
think, Mohammed, I think I gave you control. Do you have it? Do you see it?
I see it now.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Not cooperating.
I think it should be coming up now.
Yep, there it comes.
Perfect.
There you go.
So I know a lot of you might have seen these slides before, so I'm just going to go over them very quickly. We would like to set aside most of the time for the conversations and discussions about this. I'm going to go straight to the architecture. So our goal here, the major focus of this work has been to have computable consent. So we want to go beyond just recording consent in electronic form, even recording it in a standardized, interoperable electronic form. We want to be able to record it in a form that can be consumed by a service and can be enforced automatically without any manual intervention. And our goal has been to basically go all the way from where a patient interacts with the user interface to express their wishes and privacy preferences, and connect the dots all the way to the enforcement automatically without having much of a manual intervention here. So the major pieces that we've worked on, we have a consent decision service that consumes consents that are stored in FHIR format wherever they are. These are like, it could be a distributed structure or a centralized infrastructure where consents are stored. As long as they're FHIR and they follow the FHIR API, it could be connected to the consent decision service. And we have various instantiation of the consent enforcement service where in different workflows and different use cases like treatment, end-of-life decisions, privacy and exchange situations, the enforcement, the decision from the consent decision point is being enforced using a local piece of software that is integrated with the local workflow. And then on the right-hand side, we have an example of a consent management service where there's a user interface for the patient to interact with the system, capture their wishes in the form of a FHIR questionnaire, a questionnaire response to be more precise, and then turn that into a FHIR consent and a computable FHIR consent. There's some screenshots down there in the slide, and there's a link to a demo, a live demo that could you could log in and see for yourself, and eventually get stored in a consent store, a FHIR server where consents are stored. there's also the human readable format that can be exported for whatever reason, for legal purposes or having it archived on the file, etc. So that is the right hand side. And yeah, we can discuss further details about how the consent decision service works and how the consent enforcement service works. And we've also demonstrated this in a number of use cases. We have shown this to be used in eHealth Exchange, Direct Exchange, FHIR, and V2 messages, as well as some research and treatment contexts. So this is the overall. If there are any questions at this one, I'm happy to take. I would like this to be more interactive and conversational because we're a rather small group, and I'm suspecting some of you have seen these slides before. I can also pass the control to Dwayne if that would be, if you want to dig further into the implementation of some of the further details. Okay, I see no questions. Maybe we could pass control to Dwayne at this point.
I'll ask a question. This is Rita.
Mm-hmm.
What type of identifier do you use for the patient identifier in the request?
Mm-hmm. So the patient identifier is basically the architecture here is orthogonal to the type of identifier. Anything that comes in with a system and code can be matched against these file servers. There is a point to be made about where the consent query goes to when we receive a consent request, the consent decision request. We would like to go and find the consents pertaining to that patient. So the service here, the API, accepts an array of identifiers, and it uses those, basically broadcasts those into the consent stores. So if there is a patient with different identifiers at different systems, they are able to be found using that identifier. But if you're thinking of something like a statistical matching, that's something we have kind of considered out of scope, and we didn't go there.
I'm sorry, can I just dig into that a little bit? So we've got, right now this is mostly healthcare focused, right?
Right.
So
Yes.
clinical services. So if we've got a person who is also, eventually, maybe this is a larger question or separate question, which is, how do you provide consent for education, behavioral health, justice kinds of programs, other areas that are integral to a whole person approach? Would the identity management, authentication work across those various different, somebody's got 3 or 4 different identifiers?
Right. So I think the architecture supports that. So there's 2 pieces to what you just described. There is different types of identifiers that could be used. So those are already supported. Like, we are capable of supporting different types of identities. At the end of the day, the identity should match what the consent was recorded with, or the identity that is recorded in that file server where the consent is stored. So as long as those identifiers are matching, we can find the consent, even if there's different identifiers in different services, in different consent stores, basically. There is also the portion of your question that is about the nature of the content of the consent. So I understand that in different use cases, those rules are different, and different types of preferences need to be recorded. So the file consent resource provides a general, like kind of a generic structure. Being able to make that flexible enough to support different use cases is part of the work that we were focused in this project. There is always in FHIR, you can use extensions and profiling to expand what the resource offers at its core. We also have given feedback to the CBCP committee, which is in charge of the FHIR consent resource, to make sure that we can add some, at least capture some of this stuff that is very common across different use cases in the core, so that we don't need to use extensions. But the path I would foresee for basically making this useful for a new application space like yours is the major work that is involved is to actually make sure we agree on a profile of the consent resource that can capture all the requirements in your use case. And then we also make sure that those requirements are basically trickled down all the way into the query response mechanism. So basically the type of question that you would want to ask from a consent service to match against the patient consent preferences is something that needs to be kind of like double checked. Other than that, I think that the entirety of the architecture, I think, is orthogonal with respect to identifiers and also with respect to the content of the consent to a great extent. So there's a lot of flexibility here that could be used for supporting new use cases. I think like we sort of had that exercise when we moved on from privacy consents, which is the major use case on which the actual consent resource was actually based. The original use cases and the people who designed the FHIR consent resource, they only thought of the privacy use case. And then for us, it was one of those exercise instances was to actually see what is missing when we want to support, for instance, like an end-of-life decision consent. And so there, we needed to have some value sets added or some extensions used. So that is something that we also have exercised already and we are familiar with. Does that answer the question, or is there any follow-up?
To me, yeah, I mean, I think I understand it. I'm curious about others who are addressing this, whether or not, as we're thinking about trying to create a sort of a ubiquitous consent mechanism, will that architecture can incorporate it?
So Daniel Chavez here. Yeah, absolutely agree with Mohammed. I'm pretty sure the architecture supports, but a couple of relevant points. Identity in the healthcare setting is considered PHI, which means it's difficult to share outside the healthcare setting without the appropriate BAAs. This is point one. Now, the architecture can support it in probably a multi-sector environment, but the real question becomes, what do you do with identity when there's aspects or attributes of identity that conflict? And therein lies the challenge. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, Okay, I think we lost you if you said one last sentence. That last sentence I didn't hear. But I understand your concern. Like, I think the reason I didn't really want to go towards supporting statistical matching was that is sort of like a box that is out of like it's orthogonal to the architecture. You can put that box there, and then ultimately you input some demographic information and you get an ID. That ID, there's a degree of confidence in the match, but it's still going to be a vector of identifiers that could be used for searching.
Right. It's a separate function, which ideally the consent registry has a single source of truth for identity in a perfect world.
Right, which is not the world we live in, but and I understand that as a site, yes.
So if I understood what you were saying is then that becomes basically a separate service or a function, sort of. It
has to be a separate service, in my opinion. I think consent's a separate service. Identity is a separate service. They're critical for each other to be linked and tightly. It's a separate service.
Jim, did you have a comment you want to make?
I did. No, I was agreeing with that, and I didn't want to inject to this part of the conversation, but I would like to discuss what the digital identities, and I know we brought this up before, that digital identity side as a separate service marries up to the consent side, because I think there are some real, so the identity side served up as a JSON object verifiable credential can interface with a XACML type object as well. And there's grounds for exploration, in my opinion.
That's good. Other questions or thoughts or reflections on what Mohammed has said so far? Either from a technical, legal. Oh, Jennifer.
Mhm.
Greetings. Hey,
Hi.
Oh, okay,
So-
not me.
Up, down
Oh.
there. Keep going.
Okay. Me, right?
You.
Okay.
That helps.
So I think as I hear the conversation, I think we're kind of stepping into the identity resolution space. And yeah, obviously it's very complicated, but just to throw out some ideas that we've kind of thrown around in Colorado is identifying, so it's basically building in probabilistic matching. And so identifying kind of business rules where a value would be accepted as a match. And then building in some type of a staging kind of process where if there's not a match, then there's some type of like manual or human intervention that uses some of this like criteria that we're going to establish for probabilistic matching. And obviously knowing that, you know, we're talking about humans, so it's never going to be perfect, obviously. So just kind of want to share some of the things that we were thinking, or we're working through right now. We're actually working through kind of trying to identify what those rules are, et cetera. Because I'd love to hear more collaboration from the group or input.
And I mean, I would like to know that the identity, the patient identity question is something that is sort of present in every single use case and every single application space. So however we resolve that in all these other use cases that we deal with, we could basically use that same service here in the consent decision service. And I think that's, I mean, this is back to Dan's point that this was not a question or a problem that is unique to this particular space. And that's why we didn't really focus on getting into the details of that and solving that problem, because that was not really our problem. You know, that's a problem that's universally applicable to pretty much any application space in the United States where there's no unique identifier for patients. And I hope that makes sense. I'm happy to take more questions.
This is Kathy. I just kind of want to throw in there that this patient identity and matching work is really the core of what HIEs do. And so, you know, I think Dan obviously knows this well, as do some of the rest of you, but there may be a way to build in, you know, we've all got decision rules around how we match that go back to working with our health information management committees and the medical records folks at all of our data sources to ensure that we've got a chain of information around the identity verification and the patient matching. So I think there are lots of HIE resources available that can inform that whole conversation.
Right.
Mohammed, I would add in, this is Brian, I would add in that for the kinds of user stories and use cases that we're working on within Unify and that the Inc. programs are starting to work with, we're not simply talking about patient IDs or patient matching. We're talking about being able to match a particular student ID, for instance, within a school information system, with a particular Medicaid ID within a healthcare system, or a child ID, a case number within a child welfare case management system. So the problem associated with identification goes well above and beyond anything that I imagine you've had to deal with so far within the LEAP CDS.
Right, and I know that like FHIR's spend a lot of time trying to accommodate that, least like put the facilities in place so that the discovery can be facilitated. And there is a patient discovery service as part of FIRE as well. I don't know if it's part of the normative or still like kind of experimental. There is also even like a probabilistic matching type of support in FIRE itself. Yeah, and I also want to mention that there is in a different capacity, not in my capacity as the lead project, there is the question of the level of certainty or the level of assurance that you have in an identifier sometimes. And I'm suspecting that could be also concerning your application space, where you have a number of identifiers listed associated to a patient resource in a FIRE server, but some of those are not very certain. You know, there's definite level of certainty that's associated with them. For instance, you know, say this is a driver's license number or student ID that I have never been able to verify, but this is just like a patient reported ID that we just put in the resource for recording purposes. And that really informs the discovery system where, you know, which identifier is reliable and how much. And it sort of plays into the broader scope of statistical matching.
Well, Mohammed, Dan here, and I don't recall, refresh my memory, did you deal with delegated consent as in parent-child or caretaker, et cetera?
Yes.
Is that part of the decision system?
We have, and that's something that like we consider that in the discovery. It's sort of like a simple query to basically find consents that are filed either by the patient or a related person, like the guardian. It could be a whatever, and we don't confirm that part whether that person was the guardian. I think that's part of the workflow of the consent management to identify and ensure that the guardian who is filing a consent on behalf of a patient is indeed the person they claim to be, and also they have that right. But as long as that consent is validly recorded and filed, then we are able to incorporate it in the decision process. I see.
Thank you.
Jim.
Yeah, I was just on
I saw you raise your hand. I just
That's okay. I was just on the fence to
that.
comment again, and I didn't want to go. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mohammed.
No, go ahead. I just noticed that your hand was up.
I would just offer this, and I know Daniel affirmed that we'll talk more about digital identity and verifiable credentials for another session. But as we look at the potential extensibility of consent, it's important to keep that in context of the digital identity itself. And I know we've talked about patient matching and patient identification, which are important concepts, but those are a component to the patient managing their digital identity and digital identity in the context of equity. So I think it's just important to keep in mind, people are going to grant consent to have access to things or not consent to have access to things based on characteristics about their health information that closely relate to what their identity is and how they identify themselves and what they wish to share about their identity. And I think we touched upon this a bit in the last meeting. So I would just ask everybody to kind of keep in the forefront of your mind as we think about this, identity being an extension of consent and vice versa. And you know, we can discuss that further when we have to right now. I just wanted to share that thought.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
One of the questions, just to maybe you've addressed this already, in terms of, I know that, you know, between, you know, Connect Well and Live Well and the CIE and all of the work that's going on in San Diego, from a privacy perspective, how much did you engage, or how much was, you know, the privacy officer and counsel involved with sort of sort of recognizing this as a, you know, as a viable, acceptable model?
But we did have legal experts on the team, there was a legal landscaping like survey that we had as part of the project. And we have been in frequent contact with legal experts to basically get their opinion on what we've done. And I think part of this is like technological enforcement, which is really neutral with respect to what the law is. But we have had, because I think part of that informed our work is to make sure that the technology that we're building is capable of supporting all the legal nuances that are around capturing consent. One of the examples that we haven't implemented yet, and I'm not sure if it'll be in our scope because the project is getting wrapped up in a couple months, is the idea that sometimes there needs to be a workflow, that a workflow needs to be completed in order for the consent to be valid. You know, in certain use cases, for instance, to be able to be deemed qualified to file a certain type of consent, the patient has to go see a psychologist and they have to sign up. So there's an elaborate workflow that is required before what the patient actually puts down as their consent is deemed valid for legal purposes. So some of those nuances are things that we needed to be able to capture. Like I said, since, we haven't necessarily implemented all of these details, but there are the framework is flexible enough to support all these extensions. I'm wondering if Dwayne would like to chime in or take control of the screen.
Do we have time for a quick demo? Or we have 15 minutes?
I think it would be great if we could
We're
see.
15 to 30 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, it would be great if we could see the consent management UI at least.
Yeah, let me
briefly. Yeah.
How long is the demo? I missed that.
Oh, it won't take long, maybe 10 minutes. But let me just go over a couple slides before we jump into that. So
I have this is Bill Kowalski. I just have a quick question as you're doing this. Is this in production now?
It's not in production with, I mean, there's no real data that is, yeah, that is in this system. But we have live deployments of it that can be used. All of these services, I think I should have mentioned this earlier, everything is open source. They're all hosted on GitHub. And everything, every single of these services also has a live deployment that could be used for test purposes.
Thank you.
yeah. So as Mohammed mentioned earlier, that we have multiple demonstrations of consent being enforced against HL7B2, consolidated CDA, a FHIR-based exchange, both embedded and as a proxy. And what we've done in this last FHIR Connectathon is we produced UI and consent management services to show those workflows where the patient, the power of attorney or primary physician may be involved in. So we've created that. Its goal really is to analyze any privacy concerns within the patient's record, to create consent, to audit its use, revoke it if necessary, and reinstate based on some time frame constraints. Again, we developed it for FHIR Connectathon 27, and it shows the creation of consent for patient privacy, advanced directives, consent for treatment, consent for research, and POLST. We actually implemented the portable medical order. It demonstrates a questionnaire flow, the capturing of e-signatures, and it also supports, in the case of advanced directives, a notary workflow. The model that we're using here in this demonstration was derived from the state of Arizona requirements on their advanced directives and pulse. It supports both English and Spanish. And it has kind of a common flow to it within the consent management service. So there's a questionnaire and capturing of these signatures, the generation of a human readable document, and that may be a legal document. There's a review by the patient, the ability to accept, and also it goes through a validation stage. And then there's for advanced directives, there's an optional notary flow. And then ultimately the end result of that is the production of a questionnaire response, the consent, and it is, both of these are generate a provenance resource when the consent is created. We attach a digitally signed human readable document that represents that questionnaire flow, and that may or may not be state specific. We have a reference within the consent to the questionnaire response, so we can look at each one of the answers. It's done through an R4 extension, and then the provision portion of the consent itself is utilized within the CDS for consent enforcement. So that's kind of the gist of what all of our flows do, whether it be patient privacy or consent for research or any of those kinds of things. As Mohammed mentioned, this is an open source project. So you can go to San Diego Health Connect's GitHub repository and you'll see all of our demonstrations and our the source code supporting them. What I'm going to show you today, we're all running up in the Google Cloud. These are our endpoints. We'll look at the consent UI. We won't actually touch the consent decision service or the consent testing service today. We'll just jump right into it. So if you got just a few minutes, I'll go ahead and do a quick demonstration.
Great.
Okay. Let me, which one is it? Okay, so a couple things. As far as security goes, we've implemented Spring Security. We do not have this tied into a third-party identity provider. You can do that on your own. The codes there available and the hooks there are available to you to implement. So I'm just going to go ahead and log in. What we've done is we've generated, using Cynthia, 10 test patients. All of them are from Arizona. So our demonstration is kind of geared to what a patient in Arizona would see. It also assumes that during these flows that everyone is in the room. Now that may or may not be true. It certainly isn't true now because of COVID. So we'll be looking at implementing some workflows where our signature capturing capabilities are all remote. So basically this is a look at all my available consent documents currently, which ones are active, expired, revoked. I have a lot of them revoked, or in a pending stage. Pending is for advanced directive notary flows. We can actually look at, the document that was created. This is the human readable output from a patient privacy consent. It's basically showing the dates that the consent is in force. It's for a year. The data classes that are restricted, in this case, body structure was not included. The consent or the custodian of that data the patient's data is Mariposa Community Clinic, the destination, Santa Cruz Radiology, and the patient wishes to remove all sensitive information for STDs, sickle cell anemia, HIV, substance abuse, and mental health related orders. So this is basically where a patient can see all the consents they're creating. I'm going to go ahead and go through a workflow here where we have an action required of the patient. It's basically the exchange between the patient's primary provider and the healthcare information exchange. This is not completed, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. In patient privacy, there's a date requirement for the dates that this consent is going to be enforced. I'm going to select the default of a year. I'm going to deny access to specific parts of my data. So I can say body structure, family history, let's see, related persons, and I'm going to set that. The source of the data is my primary clinic. So that's Mariposa. And my destination is going to be Health Current. And as far as privacy sensitive information is concerned, I want to remove all of our resources that are flagged confidential. And that's anything that's confidentiality of R or very restricted. And then I'm going to review it or assign it, excuse me. In this case, this is Lorena. And there's the production of the consent that I just created. You'll see the dates that the consent is enforced, that family member history, body structure, and related person is not going to be delivered. And then I also want to remove any sensitive information. So I'm going to go ahead and accept that. Okay. We can go back up and we can see that consent that was just created. We can review the record. We can revoke it, and we can also reinstate it through this tool. Let's take a look at the data that was created here, because that flow we show a questionnaire response being created as well as the provenance record or resource. Search. So I'm going to search on that patient. I'm inside the consent repository right now. And I think this is the one we just created. Give it a chance to load. So we see, here's the actual consent resource. We've got an extension that points us to the questionnaire response, so we can take a look at that. And here's the answer to all of our questions based on the questionnaire. Okay. And then if we go down, we can see the attachment. This is actually the digitally signed PDF. And then we go into provisions. This is where all the enforcement occurs. So the provision says that purpose use is treat, deny, health current fire connectathon. These data classes, family member history, body structure, related person, and also remove anything with the confidentiality code of restricted. So this is what CDS is reading to determine how to enforce that consent. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, let's do another one real quick.
One quick question. This is all, the interface is all on a tablet or PC. Is it mobile at all?
This is a responsive interface. So design. So if I go in and develop it, there we go. I can actually set the display type to, right now that's an iPad, and you'll get the same experience. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So it's designed to do that. Now, in a real production application, we'd probably go down the native route for some of those things. This is basically just presenting all the services we built around consent management and those flows.
Right, and I think that's an important point to make here, that the rest of the architecture is not married to the consent management. Consent management is just an example of a consent management system that we implemented in order to demonstrate everything. So there's no insider trading between the UI and the consent management piece and the enforcement and decision-making piece. Those services can work with any other consent management service that, as long as it outputs FHIR consent resources. And same, this consent management UI can produce consent resources in FHIR that could be used by any other, consent decision service other than ours. Yeah, so that would, I just wanted to clarify that.
Super.
Okay, let's do one more. So let's do the do not resuscitate. I'll lose my, there we go. And the concept of notifications here, this is all experimental. I've got an elderly population that I generated, and I created a base rule on what kinds of consents might be required. And then I also use it to identify things like consent to treat or consent for research. Here, actually, here, let's go through the a consent to treat. So this is an example where there's a medication request by my provider, and he wishes to prescribe me Zoloft, and he needs consent for me to do that. And so basically this just goes through some wording here. This is arbitrary. That my doctor wishes to prescribe the following medication, Zoloft. This medication cannot be administered without your consent. The first step in the process, you and your physician will review some information regarding this medication, such as its use, risk, side effects, and whatever. So basically, this goes through the informed consent document where they review that. I can choose to approve it or decline it. I'm going to go ahead and approve. And the physician approves it. And that will generate the completed informed consent. Okay, and we'll see it up here as a policy type of treatment. The custodian in this case, this is the keeper of that consent, is healthcare, because we've modeled this deployment model as being deployed or supported by the Healthcare Information Exchange. So if we go back to our notifications, we should see that med request is now active, so they can actually prescribe that. This brings up some interesting issues on visibility. In our last Connect-a-thon, I articulated that consent to treat and consent to research right now, as far as FHIR is concerned, implementing them would be experimental at best. They really don't, medication requests, service requests, procedure requests, doesn't really present itself to support a consent-driven workflow. And so there needs to be some work done in those areas. And the same is true for clinical trials or consent for research. where the research subject is still how we get to that point. The flows need to be beefed up a little bit. So just be aware of that.
Okay.
Any questions on what I just showed?
Dwayne,
Okay.
I have a question with regards to your advanced directives work. I'm involved in the HL7 PASSIO Advanced Directive Working Group, and that's working on FHIR frameworks for migration of a lot of the historical CCDA and even non-CCDA advanced directive informations, and of course, depending on what the POST and MOST and DNR structures are between the states. Did you do any work within? Was this work done with regards to California's model, or I guess you mentioned Arizona's model in FHIR as well?
Okay, so yeah, so what I did was model Arizona's for the time being.
Okay.
And I did it in such a way as when the Advanced Directive Interoperability Group comes up with a common terminology, that I can codify what I'm doing. Because for me to enforce any of these consents, they have to be computable. And right now, at best, we can return responses like, the patient wants to be buried, right? From a living will, as opposed to, just asking the question, can I bury this patient, and getting a deny from the consent decision service because we were actually able to look up based on some code, right? And so there's work that needs to be done in that area. And so I have a soft implementation of the questionnaire that is supportive of the Arizona flow, but we really need to have something more generic to make it play in it if we're actually going to enforce these kinds of consents in the future. So
Dwayne, again, if I can, Dan here, I think what you're saying is it's going to be difficult to do across states. Not impossible, but to have a consent registry between California and Arizona, just 2 states, would be a challenge. Is that fair?
Well, again, let's say that you're just asking the question. I don't know if it really matters, to be honest with you. Why can't I do this if it's computable, regardless of what that form looks like? It doesn't matter if my advanced directives in Arizona or California, if the consent service has the decision service has the ability to cross FHIR consent repositories, then it should be able to.
All right, right. So it is doable. It is doable with FHIR as a resource, but to a certain degree, I think we have to be careful because we're a little bit at cross purposes with consent to share information and then consent for process and procedures. And I think maybe scope has expanded, right, to do that comprehensive consent registry to include both, which is a consent to share information for a variety of workflows, right, versus the overall complete consent registry to include process, procedures, diagnostics, etc.
Yeah, I don't know how to respond to that other than, we had a pretty small scope as far as what we were addressing. And the consent to exchange or the consent to share, we've been doing that for years, right? We have demonstrations way back in 2007 as part of the Nationwide Health Information Exchange. And some of our work exists in that code base today. So what we're doing with advanced directives, I think advanced directives or consent to treat or consent for research, those hooks are there. They just need to be expanded to support more workflows, right? We don't, if you look at the resources right now, they're just not there yet. They're immature and I can't code to them. I don't have something within those resources to drive my code. I have to make some decisions and I don't want to be making those decisions, right? So
yeah, I absolutely agree. But again, you're adding complexity when you get outside just the information sharing realm, because informed consent has a whole different set of connotations.
okay.
Dan, is that a sort of a separate topic we need to sort of focus on?
I'm not sure we need to focus on it. We need to figure out what we're trying to do with consent. Is it purely consent for information sharing and a variety of use cases like social services, like research, like advanced care, like treatment, not in the process, but information sharing to support treatment, medical, mental health, substance abuse, which is much different than saying, I recognize what happens if I prescribe this drug. That's a whole different connotation of informed consent. And unfortunately, terminology and semantics don't help us.
I think, Dan, that is a live conversation at the CBCB committee to determine, what's in scope and what's out of scope for the fire consent resource.
Yeah, right to that. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And there's been some voices that have expressed that the advanced care directives are out of scope. But the reason that was deemed out of scope was not the fact that the resource is not capable of supporting it, was because there was not enough people in the room to say we are willing to implement this to show that it works. And I think that also went towards the direction of using the contract resource, which is similar in a sense. It works on rules and agreements between two entities.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely, absolutely agree with you, Mohammed. But advanced care has a separate set of nuances, which is for many institutions, advanced care is a product and a specialty that is unique to those facilities. Versus,
I'd love to jump in here.
Pulse and most.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi. So I think that this is a really interesting topic, and obviously determining scope is important. I don't know that I agree that consent to share information versus consent for treatment versus consent for research is terribly fundamentally different with terms of what it means to be informed for consent. The requirements under the consent might vary, but I from a legal perspective, I don't disagree, or I don't agree really that what constitutes informed consent is really different. That's more of an ethical issue per se than a legal one. But I do think that if we're talking about this as a tool to allow for coordination of care, that it's likely makes sense to think broadly about what consents would be needed. If it's only for sharing information, that's one thing. But if we're talking about using this as a tool to coordinate care and allow people to have a single place to access their consents for a variety of care settings, then collecting consents related to treatment and other purposes such as these advanced directives and others, to me, makes a lot of sense. But the scope will matter as far as how people decide that.
And I want to add to that, I mean, as an example, there was a group that came to the CBCB committee. They wanted some changes and extensions to be supported so that they can model organ donation in using the same resource. So I think the technology part is one thing, whether the technology or the expressiveness of the language that the resource supports, whether or not that's sufficient. that is something that is an iterative process. You know, the more people implement, the more groups like us invest in that, there will be more feedback, and there's going to be more maturity in supporting different use cases. But there's also the question of how does it look like from a patient's perspective? As the patient, do I prefer to go into a single place where I will express my preferences and permissions? And, you know, from a user experience perspective, is it more convenient for the patient to give permission for, you know, data exchange as well as treatment purposes in a single place, in a single portal? And I think that is a question that I don't have an answer for. That's something that needs to be focus grouped, and it's a different type of question from what we're dealing with. Our focus has been to ensure that the consent resource, the FHIR consent resource, is flexible enough and expressive enough to support these use cases, all of these use cases. And advanced directive in research and treatment were part of our mandate in terms of the project plan and what was promised to the ONC to be tested and included in the demos. So that's how we draw the line. I know the CBCB group is drawing the line based on practical decisions, whether they have enough people in the audience who could support and bring feedback. Like if there is a group that says, we will model organ donation, we will bring feedback and show you how we could use the resource, they are interested in doing that. They are interested in supporting it. But I think I just wanted to add that the user experience question is also something that is a little bit less covered, at least in the CBCB conversations.
Well, but Unity team, I think we have to differentiate, be crystal clear what we're talking about, because there are big differences in informed consent for treatment, right, and informed consent as it relates to information sharing.
They are different and similar. You know, there's similarities and there's differences. And
oh, absolutely. But you know, whether I want the fact that I'm taking psychotropic drugs shared in social services and my medical community is much different than I understand the implications of me taking these drugs. There's a huge difference.
Yeah, I'm wondering if what Jennifer spoke about is we need to dig deeper into that, because I think you were saying, Jennifer, that they are considered the same or very similar.
I disagree.
So informed, I guess what I'm saying is informed consent, it at its core means that you fully understand what you're agreeing to, what the consequences of your acceptance or denial are. That my feeling is that informed consent is not different in these situations. You should understand all of those things. What underlies informed consent is the same across these examples. What legally constitutes informed consent under the law may vary. You know, it might be that a conversation is enough. It might be that you have to sign a written document. There might be different legal requirements as to what validates that informed consent. You know, there's a lot of instances where there's nothing written, where you simply have a conversation with your doctor and he, you know, and then that's it. In most medical settings, there's no signing of documents, but in the instance where you're having you're consenting to your information to be shared, most of those do require some kind of affirmative consent that is usually documented in some usually electronic form. And so I'm saying ethically informed consent is the same. What it means is the same. The legal, how that the law captures that might vary, but I don't think that
Jennifer, with one key difference, if I'm informing consent to have a surgery, it's usually within the institution. It's not cross-institutional. where information sharing is cross-institutional, that being the primary difference, and that's where the
Yes, but I
conversation
think
breaks
that
down.
what I think that the essence of what we're doing here is that we want to coordinate care between institutions. And so what that surgery that you get at the medical center might matter as far as support services that you will get from other institutions. And so if this is a tool to coordinate that care, all of those consents are likely to matter, is what I'm saying. That the scope might be broader than what you are describing, at least is how I see it.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, but I don't see that to be a legitimate use case. Whether I consent to robotic surgery has nothing to do with my homelessness or my substance abuse problem. And
I disagree.
Right? And
I disagree.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, because your homelessness will affect your recovery.
Yeah.
So knowing that the homeless, I mean, there's so many ways you're not seeing the intersectionality.
I am. I am, Jennifer.
Okay. But don't forget, we're also describing the ability to enable people through a UI to make those decisions dynamically around their information sharing, irrespective whether it is internal or external to the coordination of care. And as such, just arguing one use case applies and another one doesn't won't be realized in a UI that allows me to dynamically select, I'm sharing this and I'm not sharing that.
I agree.
But yeah, I agree with that as well. But given that most of our population is at the 8th grade level, it becomes incredibly confusing to try to do the same workflows on the same UI for medical purposes and information sharing purposes. They are incredibly different.
You can't dismiss this case on the basis that you feel the population may not be adequately equipped to use it. That's healthcare literacy.
Can I just make
which is the social determinant of health?
Guys,
well, health literacy is a broad brush issue that concern that everything is a social determinant of health. You're right. Yeah.
So let me. I think we have sort of raised some of the really thorny questions here that we're going to need to. One of the things we want to do in the upcoming interviews around this and the literature search is really, make sure that we're clearly defining these things and articulating them with our council help, with Jennifer and Chris and other folks who are bringing the legal perspective to the table, so that we can clarify it for folks, right? So part of what we want to be able to do is really understand what it is, what we're offering, or what is being offered, and whether or not that is covered by the legal requirements of it. So I think that we're going to have a lot more conversations around this as we go forward to try to sort of nail down what is in, what isn't, what the subtleties are, what the context means. If I'm hearing the conversation here correctly. So let me, I know that this is a invigorating discussion as always, but I want to also manage the time here and just, I want to, thank people for showing up and for presenting today. Any last comments before we sort of complete today's session? We can continue this.
Yeah, quick.
Well. Yep.
Quick question for Dwayne and Mohammed. Did your CMS do any work with integration in the EHRs or other outside documentation systems besides the consent registry?
We're basically we are assuming that we share the FHIR servers. That's the point of contact. So we're not, tightly coupled to an EHR. We are connected to the EHR via sharing FHIR service, but also part of that was deliberate because we wanted to stay in abstract as much as possible from getting dependent into a specific system. However, I also want to note that this is an example. Like the consent management service here is an instance that we did to demonstrate. So I can imagine a similar consent management service that is like an app inside an EHR service, or like a smart on Fire app that could be hosted within an EHR. Those are all valid possible ways of having a consent management service.
Thank you.
Dwayne and Mohammed, thank you very much for your taking time out to share that with us again. I'm sure we'll have some more additional questions for you. Hope to be able to integrate, sort of work with you as this gets a little further along. So with that, any other last comments before we close out today? Questions?
Other than thank you so very much, Mohammed and Dwayne, for making a time to speak with us.
Terrific.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate the time.
Okay, great. Thank you. And you're welcome to join us on this work as we go forward, of course, as though your plate's not already overflowing. So we'll see everyone back here next week. And notes will be sent out or posted on the site, and the recording will also be available pretty soon for folks who are not available, want to check in. And I'll encourage you to sort of ask questions, and maybe we can continue some of these dialogues, both in the context of the consent and on the hub there. Okay, everyone.
Thanks.
Happy summer all.
Thanks all.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.